much mabrika and greetings to my Indigenous brothers around the Caribbean, particularly to our moderators, Anne Worm and Tess Peterson, Director of the Institute for People's Enlightenment, Carlton Antoine, Anthony Lucian, representative of the Kalinago Council Office of Dominica, President of the Garifuna Nation, Egbert Eugenio, President of the Santa Rosa community in Trinidad, Mr. Ricardo Hernandez, to our historians, Joel Paris, he's still on his way, and Lennox Honeychurch. Also, Railsha, Andrew, good evening to every one of you, and good evening also to our listeners. It's indeed a pleasure to be here with Indigenous brothers and sisters around the Caribbean as we celebrate our World Indigenous Day. But for me, it's even more exciting that we can join our voices as one, despite of our geographical boundaries. Well, thanks to technology. The first time I spoke with Mr. Antoine, who is one of the directors of the Institute for People's Enlightenment, I got to understand the work that they were doing in Grenada and that effort of trying to foster greater awareness of the Indigenous heritage and doing the Enlightenment series. At the time when we spoke, he mentioned how they were trying to get the government to recognize Leapers Hill Day as a Memorial Day. And this conversation resonated powerfully within me for one major reason. One, it made me realize that despite of us living in what we call a free society, we are still struggling to be recognized as Indigenous people. We are still struggling to be respected, and oftentimes we are often misunderstood. In Dominica, we live on a reserve on land that is communal, and recently the name was changed from Carib territory to Kalinago territory, a name which the people thought would better represent who they were. And we are still hoping that one day our country will be called Waitukubuli, which was the original name for Dominica before Christopher Columbus came here. But in the context of my first encounter with Mr. Antoine and his wish to have Leapers Hill Memorial Day be a national day in Grenada, we in Dominica are also struggling to have a national day here too, where our Indigenous people can celebrate their successes. And this too, we have been struggling to have the government recognize. And so it was with this particular mention that made me realize that we, the Indigenous people, all have similar challenges across the globe, no matter where we are. And therefore, it is with hope that I look to the future as we network and form a chain of unification amongst us, so that we can explore our strengths, we can build on it, and we can work on our weaknesses as one, and we can seek to break down the barriers that have kept us back for so long. This year's theme, the World Indigenous Day, is the role of Indigenous women in preserving and passing on of traditional knowledge. And before I read the message from the United Nations, I just want to say a few words on how we as Kalinago women in Dominica have been contributing to traditional knowledge and passing that on to our children. Many people say, particularly men, they say that they can't live with us. They can't live with us, but I say definitely they cannot live without us, without women, because women are powerful. We have contributed tremendously to developing strong societies through the passing of knowledge to our children. In Dominica, as Indigenous women, we have contributed tremendously in keeping our craft traditions alive, our culinary arts, our language, our dress, our agricultural practices, and our environmental conservation practices, even our myths and our legends. And today, even many of our Indigenous women are often not given the credit that they deserve. And many times we are looked down upon because perhaps of our socioeconomic status. However, I will say that we have made meaningful contribution in so many ways that money can never buy. And the Indigenous community have not been given the full support by the government in terms of the needed legislation and resources that we need to be able to thrive as an Indigenous people. And I say that in the context of our language, because for a while now, we have been speaking a lot about having our Indigenous language revived. And even though there are a few activities that go on in the community, one of the main forces that we need is to have our language be part of our school curriculum because it identifies who we are as a people. And it also helps our children to appreciate their culture and their tradition. And that has been a challenge for us. So we're hoping that as time goes on and that we're able to network, we can build on our strengths and are able to ensure that these necessary legislations are put in place to allow our people to be able to embrace their traditions a little bit more. I will now go to the message from the United Nations, written by the Secretary. He said, on this year's International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, we are highlighting the role of Indigenous women in preserving and passing on traditional knowledge. Indigenous women are knowledge keepers of traditional food systems and medicines. They are champions of Indigenous language and cultures. They defend the environment and Indigenous peoples' human rights. To build an equitable and sustainable future that leaves no one behind, we must amplify the voices of Indigenous women. Indigenous traditional knowledge can offer solutions to many of our common challenges. On many recent visits to Suriname, I learned firsthand how Indigenous people are protecting their rainforest and its rich biodiversity. On this International Day, I call on member states to implement the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples and to promote Indigenous traditional knowledge for the benefit of all. End of message. So I just want to close by saying it's really a pleasure to be with Indigenous brothers around the Caribbean. And I hope that we can continue to network and strengthen our bonds so that we can move on as an Indigenous community with one voice to do what we should to ensure that we get the respect and the recognition that we need as Indigenous people in the Caribbean.